Good evening and welcome to the Pompey Politics Podcast.
I'm Ian Tiny Morris.
And I'm Simon Sainsbury.
Good evening, everybody. And after a couple of weeks of local focus, I think there is my post-traumatic quasi-Kwarteng disorder has eased back a little bit. So we're prepared to venture this evening into matters of national importance. And it's the Sunday, and the Jeremy Hunt hasn't been thrown under a bus yet. So things are looking up for me, Simon, are they not?
Yeah, this week's Chancellor seems to be, seems to still be in post. So, let's see. It's early days. We've got a few days left of the month yet.
Absolutely. So focus this evening is on the autumn statement, and as with these things, it's always good to bring on a couple of learned guests, and we've got a fresh face on the podcast. So welcome to Mark Coates. We'll give Mark a chance to introduce himself a bit later, but it would be fair to say, Mark, a Labour activist and potential councillor next May in the slightly blue stronghold of Hayling Island.
Yeah, I'd like to be the first. That would be one for my bucket list.
Absolutely. And I wouldn't like to say an old familiar face, but a familiar face nonetheless. Welcome, Steve Pitt.
And with that, he's just dropped off the stream. What have you said?
Excellent.
We'll let Steve battle away with the.
He'll be back.
But as well, indeed, as is ever his modus of operandi, he'll be back. So let's set the scene a little bit. So on Thursday, just in case anybody missed it, there was another Chancellor's autumn statement.
Slightly different in this kind of this time round, wasn't it? Because rather than just throwing money in all directions and saying, "Oh yeah, well I'll let you know, I'm going to pay for it in a month or so's time," it was a full and detailed proposal rather than just half of one to send the markets into a massive spooked frenzy.
Yeah, indeed. So I'm going to cover off some of the points just to kind of set the scene a bit, and then we'll let our guests introduce themselves a little bit more fully. So thank you both for joining us. I'm not going to do an impression of Jeremy Hunt, but here we are anyway, nonetheless. So the Chancellor's statement on Thursday was talking about the government's priorities are stability, growth, and public services, with economic stability. Economic stability relies on fiscal sustainability, and the autumn statement sets out the government's plan to ensure the national debt falls as a proportion of the economy over the medium term. This will reduce debt servicing costs and leave more money to invest in public services, support the Bank of England's action to control inflation, and give businesses the stability and confidence they need to invest and grow in the UK. I mean, there in that paragraph from the statement, that's basically the whole kind of thing. I've saved him about 4 hours.
Yeah, no, you've done it, but these are your editing skills, Simon. You managed to turn this into a viable podcast every week, so I would expect you to be able to wield the surgeon's knife with accuracy and precision.
Oh, bless you. I've literally picked the most appropriate paragraph in the first page of his statement. So, and not edited it more than that. So, anyway, if he wants to pivot and wants to take advantage of our editing services, we're happy to offer them. So, what things have been on offer then from the Chancellor? So, just as another headline, so the forecasts that came out of the OBR were that the growth this year would be 4.2%, and next year will be 1.8%. And the IMF predicts that a third of the world's economies will be in recession this year or next, and the borrowing this year will be 7.1% of GDP, which is about £7 billion. The Chancellor also refers to his new fiscal rules. I remember back in the day of Gordon Brown and his fiscal rules. Underlying debt must fall as a percentage of GDP in 5 years, which he's given himself a bit more headroom there because he's extended it from 3 years. And public sector borrowing must fall below 3% of GDP. So, summary of the items. So these were these things. So, 20 billion increase on research and development, 14 billion cutting in business rates, £6 billion more for the home investment from 2025, 3.3 billion more for the NHS, 2.3 billion more for education, 1 billion more for social care, and a further 1.7 billion in the next fiscal year. No cuts to capital budgets for 2 years. Social housing rent increases will be capped at 7%. That's helpful if you're in a social housing, but obviously not if you've got a private landlord. 1 billion extension of the household support fund. The energy price guarantee is increased to £3,000. So that's based on the typical usage of the household, and is extended for 12 months because it was going to be 18 months, then it was 6 months, and then it's 18 months again. Benefits up 10.1%. And some one-off payments, £900 for households on means-tested benefits, £300 for a pensioner household, £150 for those in receipt of disability benefits, and the pension triple lock is retained, as I'm sure many pensioners will be happy to hear. So here's some of the downsides. Defence spending is going to be kept at the 2% of GDP, so basically reducing or removing the planned increase to 3%. The 45% levy on producers of electricity. A windfall on oil and gas profits is increased to 35% from 25% and extended to March 2023. Local governments will be allowed to increase council tax by up to 5%, which is up from 3%. I'm sure that will come up later on. The dividend and capital gains tax allowance is reduced. The top rate of income tax, which is the 40% bracket, will now be applicable from £125,140 instead of £150,000. The personal tax allowance, except for the 45% rate, is frozen, and the inheritance tax is frozen until April 28. Vehicle excise duty applies to electric vehicles from April 2025. There we go. How was that?
You've done well there. You cut the 4-hour. So that's the background. That's the synopsis. A bit of giveth and a bit of taketh away, as there is with every budget. So we'll now dive into some analysis. But first, to meet our guests, if you'd like to introduce yourself, a little bit of your background and where your politics are at. And if I can start first with Mark.
Well, thanks very much for inviting me, everyone. I've been begging you in for a little while. I'm just a local teacher on Hayling, but I suppose I started getting involved in 2016, moved back to Hayling Island and got involved in the ferry and worked a lot, Steve, with Matt Winnington on that. But yeah, I led that campaign, and I managed to get Richard Branson interested. He only gave us a few £1,000s, but it was enough, wasn't it? And we used that to really generate the interest. And of course, it's all down to Baker Trait now, who run the ferry, the success of that. But that made me feel pretty good. And since then, I haven't stopped. And the charity that I started, the Heart of Hayling Boxing Club, won a Queen's Award earlier this year. So that was a nice outcome as well. And then I stood for Labour, and we moved up. It's small stuff. I'm right at the beginning, not as far as Steve's got or any of your other guests that you have. But I managed to move from 300 to a coveted 800 votes, and push the Conservatives a little for the first time on Hayling. Well, the money's on me to maybe become the first ever Labour councillor next year. So we'll see what happens in May. But thanks for inviting me onto a big boy show.
No worry, Mark. You're very welcome, and I think it is the story of the community activism that then accidentally moves you towards standing for office, and yeah, that's a pretty steep hill to climb, because there's always been a sort of paradox that in Havant and Hayling Island, that if we put a blue rosette on a tin of beans, they'd have a pretty fair chance of winning it. So yeah, good luck in your endeavours next May.
Thanks.
And Steve, I'm sure most folk will know of you, but if you can give us the synopsis for any new, we might have brought in a whole new audience from Hayling.
Can't hear you, Steve.
This is the same problem we had in that off air just before.
Yeah, the technical issues seem to be I don't know whether it's some sort of Windows update that's playing havoc. Can you? Steve, can you hear us? Okay, we can't hear you at all. But at the moment, you don't seem to be speaking anyway. So I don't know. Oh, okay. Right. I'm going to try and run through the things that I did with Mark. I'm going to try muting you and then unmuting you my end, see whether that makes a difference. We are now practiced at this, so please bear with us, listeners. So sorry about that. Has that made any difference? No. Okay. Have you got anything? So with the settings at the bottom there in the cog, whether your audio settings are set right. Failing that, Steve, I've got a number you can dial into, and we can get you at least your audio from there.
Shall we crack on with the conversations with Mark? And do you want to then
Yeah, let me sort Steve out, and then you crack on with Mark.
Marvelous. So it'll just be the Tiny and Mark show for the minute, and we'll kick these about. So one of the things we asked for in advance of the show, Mark, was your kind of hopes and fears for the fiscal statement, and you were good enough to give us some thoughts. A couple of the things you called out were that you hoped that the top rate of tax, which famously in the quasi-quarteng ill-fated, let's drop that from 45 to 40%. Your hope was that that threshold was reduced and that they did something about capital gains and dividend tax. So it looks like, though, you got those two things on your wish list. I don't know whether you had an inside line to Jeremy, but what were your overall thoughts, and were you pleased to get some of those headline items included?
Well, they do drop hints. That seems to be normal these days, doesn't it? I don't know why that is. That it always used to be that you told us what was going to happen in the press room or in Parliament, but now they leak everything beforehand. It's the modus operandi, which Simon was referring to earlier. So I did get a hint, but I yes and no for me. It's better than the last budget. For sure.
Well, let's be fair. As at the time, I was a card-carrying Conservative member, and I wasn't wildly keen on the last budget, which is an understatement. So, it was a pretty low bar to clear, wasn't it, to be better than the last one, which seemed to delight nobody.
Well, I have mixed feelings about this one. I understand what they were trying to do, and it was trying to get trust back. And I think is it Andrew Stacey, the head of the Bank of England, said that our reputation was damaged. They were trying to settle the markets. I understand what they were trying to do, but as far as that threshold goes, yes to lowering the 45p threshold, but for me, no to freezing the 20p threshold. As I understand it, which is an area that might be worthy of discussion, people on lower incomes are likely to spend more. And I think that it's a good way to stimulate the economy, apart from anything else, the obvious moral reasons, not to tax it. What are we now? 12,000, I think it is, isn't it?
It's about that. Yeah. So 12 and a half, I think.
12,570. And I think that's a shame that he's frozen that. I think he could have moved that up, but the other half I like. And then as far as the capital gains tax goes, I know he's dropping the threshold there incrementally, but I do agree, and I am shamelessly stealing what Tax Justice UK have suggested. I quite like the idea of just having a simplified tax system where all income is taxed the same way, and as I understand it, that could give us 14 billion just by treating everyone the same, treating all those streams of income in the same way. So that's what I'd like to have seen. But yeah, a movement in the right direction.
Yeah, and I guess when we look at the capital gains tax at the moment, the threshold is £12,000. So you can make a profit from a sale and realise that, and that's dropping pretty sharply, though, isn't it? It's I think it's halving to 6,000 next April, and then halving again the following April to £3,000. So it's one of those things where for me, just looking at it, that for me almost seems a bit more tokenistic, and I guess on that agenda of sort of personal wealth. I guess there's an element of if somebody is pulling a dividend either from shares that they own or the drop of £9,000 over 2 years, yes, it will make a difference in terms of the ability to move the income in, but it probably isn't going to. It seems to be, to me, more signalling than it does raising significant revenue.
Yeah, I think tokenistic is a good description. Whereas the people who are paying the 45p are going to be paying about £100 a month more in tax, as I understand it. That small.
Yeah, if you're on
little bit up.
100, if you're on 150k, it will again, like you say, it will make or over, it's a bit of a difference. And again, £100 is £100, but if your take home salary is significant, then
You can
I
shoulder
think, I think that's that. Most people would not be shedding too many tears for anyone who's pulling that kind of salary. It's interesting that the tax burden actually is higher. Many people might not know that once you hit 100k, you have to pay back the personal tax allowance at £1 for every £2 earned. So actually, between that figure of I think it's 125,340, you actually pay 70% income tax on that over the time, which is something that's seldom talked about. So from a tax perspective, things look pretty good from the top earner, but as you say, the freezing of the personal tax allowance is fundamentally going to hit everybody who earns less than 100,000. I think it also, I think when Rishi was Chancellor, this, and again, while the Lib Dems are trying to sort out their technical issues, the raising of the personal tax threshold was a Lib Dem policy that was brought in during coalition, and the Conservatives rather sensibly kept it and had raised it every year up until I think it was 2021 when they froze it, and now that seems to be the way forward.
I think we might have got somewhere with our technical issues. I'm just gonna, Steve, you said that you hoped that you might have your audio working again.
I kept clicking it, and eventually it unmuted. Is it working?
Yes, we can hear you. Yes.
Okay.
we have the voice of Steve, and we've now just lost Ian.
We've lost Ian, so it's like musical chairs in here this evening.
Yeah, it's all right. It's not like we need to put another 50p in the meter. We can only have 3 people on at once or something. So I don't know whether you what you caught of that, Steve, while we were trying to sort that out. Was there anything you were hoping for in the statement?
Well, I mean, obviously, from my perspective, I ought to introduce myself actually because I didn't do that, did I? So I'm Steve Pitt. I'm a Lib Dem, and I'm the cabinet member for Culture, Leisure, and Economic Development in Portsmouth. So yeah, I mean, I looked at it, and the devil's always in the detail with these things, and there's a hell of a lot of detail missing from that statement. Our financial director sent us through a debrief that night, and he's got lots of gaps in it, saying to be confirmed, not yet clarified, no detail in statement, etc. So there's a lot of unknowns still going on here. But I mean, the bit we haven't touched on yet is all they're actually doing is shoveling more liability onto local councils to plug financial gaps, which is a different way of taxing people. And it's, once you start freezing personal allowances and you start increasing the amount you offer, it makes it laugh, the offer to local councils to raise council tax in order to plug the gap that they're not getting from the government, you're in a pretty invidious mess. And these problems have been going on for, pretty much my entire life. And that is that there's no recognition that in order to have good quality public services, you need to fund them properly. And this country's never taxed fairly, because if it's not about how much somebody pays, it's what they get for it that matters. And actually, when you ask people if you're prepared to pay more to get more or retain what you've got, people will generally be supportive of that. So we do a survey every year as a council. Are you prepared to pay an extra 1-2%, whatever it is, on your council tax in order to keep local services? We always get a majority of people come back saying yes. So people don't mind paying for something that they value. What they do object to is the government shoveling their money around to cover their own political mistakes, while they're busy playing musical chairs. I mean, and just to say what I mean by that, there's something that people would know as the 4 great offices of state: Home Secretary, Foreign Secretary, Chancellor of the Exchequer, and Prime Minister. We've had 25 holders of those positions in 7 years. It's almost, I think it might even be unprecedented in modern British politics. And that's why we're in the mess we're in, and that's why we've got no direction. And this budget's done nothing to improve it. The head of the CBI is saying this week it's not a plan for growth, and that's really worrying, because another 12 years of flat growth followed after what's looking like a 12 to 18 months of a fairly shallow recession is just what we've been doing for the last 12 years. So if this is the Tory plan to keep doing what we've been doing for the last 12 years, then I utterly reject it. Simple as that.
It's an interesting one though, Steve, isn't it? Because if you look at the ill-fated quasi-Kwarteng budget,
Was it a budget? I thought it was a practical joke.
it was a fiscal statement, I believe, was the but ultimately, that, you know, if you again, and I can't claim to be a good scholar of economics, but ultimately,
Neither can he.
Well, indeed. But if you're going to stimulate the supply, you know, that was a very brave approach to stimulate the supply side of the economic equation, and it was universally rejected by the markets, and the bond markets crashed, and the pound, which was already on a downward slump with the FDA raising rates faster than we were. So there was an element of, I think it's an interesting point that ultimately, the IMF are saying that 30% of the world's economies will be in recession. They went for the radical option, which went hideously wrong. So I guess my question is, the alternative to the only other alternative, and I'd welcome your thoughts on it, would be just to borrow like there's no tomorrow and spend. Is that kind of what you were hoping for, or do you think there's a third way?
I don't think that is the only alternative at all, Ian. And I don't think that I don't think it was a budget for growth. It was clearly trickle down economics yet again, a policy discredited nearly a generation ago. It doesn't work. Cutting the top rate of income tax, but not doing significant. Sorry, my dog's just got back from his walk. He's making a fuss of me. But not doing enough to help people on middle and low incomes is just foolish. I mean, we've been calling as a party for a cut in the headline rate of VAT for a 12-month period to stimulate spending in the economy for about a year. And nobody wanted to listen to that. But if you want people on medium and low incomes to still spend, and they're the people that go out and support the restaurants, they're the people who go to the public houses, they're the people who who use their disposable income in local economies. What's going to encourage them to do that? All we've done is tighten their purse strings so much that they can't. They're choosing between heat or eat. There's no balance. All this stuff about balancing and looking after the most vulnerable. That's not what it's doing at all. People don't want to be looked after. They want to be empowered. And this wasn't an empowering budget. It was more of the same that we've had for ages to calm markets that they upset in the first place. This isn't the budget we would have had it not been for that fiscal statement. We would have had a very different budget. But yet again, we're trying to get back within our financial means, and I absolutely support that. But we're trying to do it at a time when the economy's contracting, and we're going into recession. Growth's been flat for such a long period of time. Wages have disappeared in terms of real value over the last 12 years. We're living in a protracted period of income suppression, and it's just not going to work. So it might have calmed the markets to some extent, although they didn't actually react particularly enthusiastically to it. But it's not doing anything to sort out the country's economy. You've got to put money back into local people's pockets where they control what they spend it on, or all you're going to do is end up with, well, high streets might be dying now. They're going to be dead as a door now within the next 18 months.
Well, that seems to be, to me, the sort of bottom-up approach, which I'd agree with, but I'd suggest that Hunt's trying to stimulate the economy through the city. Now, since Brexit, I think they've lost about 1.3 trillion, but only about 7,000 jobs. Now, that's a lot less than the hit they thought they were going to take. but he's I've got a couple of things here, so excuse me for reading, but he's taken the tax surcharge has been slashed on bank profits. That's 1.4 billion he's lost there. He seems to be ripping up red tape and unleashing the dogs of private finance, thinking they're going to do it all for us, rather than looking to ordinary people on low incomes who actually, if you hadn't frozen the 20p tax, would have been able to spend more in the places you just mentioned. I must admit, I was gutted when I heard it was going to be the economy. I like talking about how much we can spend without any economic responsibility whatsoever. But realistically, I'm asking a genuine question: is that going to be effective at all? Because for me, all I saw was ripping up regulations by Lawson in the 80s led to 2008 and the financial crash. Is there any credence to what he's kind of doing there? What do you think, Steve?
No, I don't think there is. I don't see that anything that's happening is credible, or that anybody is saying it's likely to work and be successful. I mean, the market reaction. This is the extraordinary thing. The pound crashed after the financial statement. The pound went down after this. So, nobody greeted it with massive enthusiasm. If we're now supposed to celebrate the fact that the market only downturns by a small amount on the announcement of a Conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer, we've come to a very strange world, in my view. And a Conservative Party that's clearly at war with itself. I mean, the right-wing press are saying that now the Tory party's become the Labour Party. The European Reform Group are still screaming blue murder about just about everything. But, this is something I often return to in these debates. All the time we've got the first past the post as our electoral system in this country. We are doomed to keep going around in this circle over and over and over again, because political parties are held hostage by their minorities.
Well, there do seem to be cycles for sure. I see Hunt copying Lawson in the 80s.
Yeah.
I see Kwarteng copying Thatcher, but then the rate of tax was like 83% and she brought it down to 60, not from 45 to 40. I just see copying actually going on, and cycles, as you say.
And what I was saying just now about lowering tax, and as the idea that lowering tax should be a principle. I don't think it has to be a principle. Good quality public services, a health service that functions properly, that's a principle. Lowering money isn't principle. That's just an ideological belief. It's not a principle.
So let me throw a curveball in there then, gentlemen, which is that, again, it's no secret, Steve, that it's been National Lib Dem policy to put an additional penny on income tax as a hypothecated tax for the NHS.
Yep.
If we go back, it was a Boris thing, that the 1.25% on national insurance, which meant that the contribution came from both the individual and business, that was hypothecated and ring fenced for the NHS and adult social care. For me, that you touched on it in your statement there about, people said they were happy to chip in a bit more, and all the major opposition parties went absolutely apoplectic, to the point of, how can you ask people to pay more when there's a cost of living crisis, choosing heating over eating? And in a famous piece of Borisism, suddenly not only was that hypothecated tax reversed or delayed, but the national insurance threshold shot up so that everybody earning median wage or below no longer has to pay any national insurance. So is it really a case that people are happy to pay, or are they happy to pay theoretically until they're actually asked to dip their hand in their pocket?
Nobody likes paying tax, but I go back to what I said just now. You have to give them something to believe in and something they want to pay for. So if you're just saying we're going to charge you more, and let's face it, who believes either the Labour Party or the Conservative Party, or who would believe my party, if they actually say they're going to fix the NHS? Because every political party said that in every manifesto for my entire life. So nobody believes it anymore. So therefore, when they're asked to pay more for it, they don't believe they're going to get value for money. There was actually proposals brought forward by Norman Lamb during the coalition years, which he tried to stick with afterwards and got bugger all interest, frankly, from anybody else. And that is in finally doing a proper review of health and social care in this country, so they are not two detached systems from each other. The reason we've got a health crisis with ambulances queuing up is they can't get the people into the beds quick enough. And the reason there's people in the beds who don't need to be in the beds is they can't get discharged out into social care because the government doesn't fund it properly locally. And they see the two things as separate. You know, they haven't. If you're going to fix things, you've got to fix them properly, and nobody's got the guts to do it. That's the reality. You know, they'll fluff around the edges of it and they'll pretend they're doing something. But you go to the public and say, oh, we're going to charge you a bit more on your national insurance for this. And the point is, national insurance is supposed to be for that in the first place. It shouldn't be ring-fenced for that. It should be for that. It's become just part of income tax.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a fair statement. Is that, you know, again, but I think it's that piece, isn't it, where you know, if you look at the money that's generated through national insurance versus the spending that it's supposed to cover, I think we could probably do, and maybe that's a future show for us to look at the whole the whole NHS spending. So I'm just going to quickly throw to Simon for question 4.
Well, yeah, I don't know whether we've kind of covered it in what you'd said, Steve, but before the announcement, you'd shared concerns about the impact on local government budgets, and you've spoken a bit to it. Have those fears been realised or not? What would that look like for the city?
Well, it's not what it looks like for the city. It's what it looks like for every local authority in the country. I mean, can you believe that 2 Conservative county council leaders, one from Kent, one from Hampshire, wrote to the Prime Minister urging them to have a serious rethink about how they're going to fund local government post 2025-26? I mean, Roy Humby has spent most of the last week, probably because he got a jackboot up his backside, rowing back from that and saying, oh, I didn't mean that at all. Well, he did, because he was quoted in the paper as saying it. And he hasn't said that they misquoted. They said he was misrepresented. Well, funny that 2 council leaders were misrepresented. I haven't heard the one from Kent saying that he was misrepresented when they both signed the same letter. So it's a bit odd. But clearly, we are in a situation where council funding is in crisis. And the government does this deliberately because they know that the general public, unfortunately, do not understand what councils do. You know, if you look at what people complain about, they complain about missed bin collections, they complain about potholes, they complain about dog poo, they complain about, you know, leisure centres not opening properly, those sorts of things, which are a tiny, tiny fraction of where most of the money goes. Now, the vast chunk of our controllable spend goes on social care. We have children in placements who pre-COVID, we would have been paying about £3 a week for. Now we're paying £30,000 a week for those placements. And yet what's the government prepared to do about it? Absolutely nothing. They're not interested in the problems that councils have. They never have been, never will be, because they see us as the cannon fodder that they can shove out the front to get the stick back from the public. And they can now, you know, it was trailed in advance. In fact, that budget was the most leaked document in political history. I think nobody knew. None of it came as a surprise because everybody knew what was in it. But they, you know, trailing that you're going to allow councils to raise the amount of council tax they can raise in order to deal with their financial problems. They're not our financial problems. They're financial problems that government is creating by not addressing the crisis in social care. The bills for looking after people are going through the roof. And there is no recognition of that at all, other than, oh, you can charge more people council tax on your council tax if you want to. That's not strategic thinking, and it's certainly not going to help the NHS, which is now riddled with endless procedural problems and far too many middle management people. Put health back in the hands of healthcare professionals and get rid of the managers. That will save you the money on the NHS you need to drive back to frontline healthcare. The country's in an absolute mess. I'm 53 years old now, and I grew up under Margaret Thatcher. And whilst I didn't like her and didn't agree with anything she did, I did at least believe that she was doing what she wanted to do and she knew why she was doing it. I don't believe that of this government at all. I don't think they've got a clue what they're doing. I think all they're trying to do is keep the ship afloat long enough to say enough Hail Marys to think that maybe things will get better before the next election. That gives me no confidence whatsoever that we're not all heading to hell in a handcart at a very, very fast pace. I've never been this scared about the future of local government or the future of this country.
And so I guess, Steve, just to look at some of the numbers there, because and I get the concern. You know, we live in very, you know, very challenging times. I guess when, you know, when I read through a couple of the Commons briefings, there was very little specific there about, you know, local council funding, other than that departmental budgets were going to be frozen with the exception of health. But I guess, you know, if I was looking at this objectively, you know, if historically you could raise council tax by 3% and you've now got the ability to raise it by 5%, then surely, you know, that's got to help bring more money into the coffers of PCC, and in Mark's case, you know, Hayling. Surely that's got to help.
No. Well, of course it will help in as much as it makes it slightly better than it was before it happened. But we were expecting this year to be looking at around about 2% pay settlement, and it's over 6%. That's millions of pounds. You know, if you raise council tax by a 1% in Portsmouth, it raises about £1 million. If you raise it by 2%, so you know that's what you're looking at. The cost of energy to the council and the finance settlement on our staff massively exceeds even what 5% would bring. And the cost of social care has gone up by more than the 2% that the raising council tax with that preset would raise. So they have done nothing to close the gap. That gap still exists, and councils are still hemorrhaging money, which is why those county council leaders and councils all over the country are saying, you can pass the buck to us, in the knowledge that we'll probably have to do that. We'll probably have to put up the council tax by those amounts just to stop ourselves from becoming financially unstable, knowing that we will then take the kicking on your behalf at the ballot box next year, and you'll have done nothing to solve the problem. That's not responsible government, Ian, on any level. They have to take a responsibility to say, this is what's happening. We need to address this and we need to sort it out, not kick it down the road to local authorities. And isn't it notable that it's the Conservative local authorities that are screaming the loudest, because the counties have the largest responsibility for social care and the greatest costs, and therefore they've got the biggest budget deficits. Hampshire's was 80 million before this happened. It's over 100 million now, and that's just one county.
And yeah, I'd just like to bring Mark in on this one now. So Mark, you've heard what Steve said, and again, you know, understandable. You know, large wage settlements, and obviously there's an announcement that the national living wage will go up next year. You know, what are your fears or hopes for Havant?
I agree that actually this stuff should be funded, and I do think there's room for those with the broadest shoulders to provide, as I understand, about 37 billion towards that shortfall by taxing nom-doms and having a capital gains tax that ensures everyone pays the same, and actually simplifying the system and probably closing most loopholes. But one thing that struck me from Humby's response, which obviously was misrepresented, whatever, is that he said that since the 40s and 60s, there's been no way for councils to bring about initiatives that can in some way fundraise for them. They can't generate their own revenue. Now, I looked at what Norfolk have done with Norse, and I think they raised their profits went up by about 16 million last year. They've managed to get the contracts in a lot of local councils, mainly Conservative ones. They've used local contractors. The quality of what's being provided has definitely dropped, without a shadow of a doubt. But they've generated money through Norse. Is there anything that I first of all, I'm not saying that councils should actually go out and make all their own money. I think they should be properly funded. But is there a way that they can generate their own revenue, or do you think they're not business people, and actually that would fail?
Well, I think councils have been generating their own revenue. And the problem was that some of them got a bit crazy. So Spelthorne's a good example. Croydon's another one, where they basically went bust, and they went out and speculated on commercial property portfolios that weren't very well thought out. Now, fair play to our Conservative predecessors at the council in Portsmouth. The commercial property portfolio that they put together was on the whole financially sound. The problem with that is that whilst it can generate income through investments, and I'll come on to other ways that you can do that in a second, but this is one that a lot of councils have been down. Unless you actually have a really good set of finance officers and you've got some commercial experience in the council team, you will get yourselves in a bit of a pickle. So Spelthorne went and bought all sorts of stuff that subsequently didn't make any money. You had councils around the country buying shopping centres because they wanted to regenerate them. Well, somebody should have told them that retail's suffering, and now's not a really good time to be doing that. So, and consequently, it put them in financial difficulty. So the government changed the rules about the use of the Public Works Loan Board. You couldn't continue to borrow for commercial gain. That puts even councils like Portsmouth in a sticky position, because when you've got an investment, let's just, hypothetical example, you've bought a massive warehouse somewhere in the country and it's turning a good profit. At some point, you've got to refurbish it. You'll need to relet it. You'll need to invest in the building, look after it. You are not allowed to borrow the money to do that. If you do, you then have to dispose of the asset to recover that money. You're not allowed to replenish the asset, improve it and keep it. So the inevitability is that councils over a period of time will be forced to relinquish their property portfolios. So those that have got them will need to, as they need to flip them, which was always the plan around them, they will need to be disposed of. That's going to put even more pressure on councils. Now, there are ways you can income generate, most notably before 2019 and the pandemic, and then certainly the cost of living crisis and all the well-publicised stuff around energy companies. There were a number of councils around the country that went around setting them up, and thank God we managed to stop the one that was planned in Portsmouth, Victory Energy, which still cost us several million quid just to get rid of it. If that had proceeded, we'd have been facing a £30 million black hole now, which is what happened with Robin Hood Energy elsewhere. And the one that they had in Bristol. So councils have tried to be entrepreneurial in the past in order to replace the money that they don't get in from government anymore. But unfortunately, government's now changed the rules because of these people doing crazy schemes to make it even harder for those of us who've tried to use the system to plug the gaps. Having said that, councils do income generate. My own portfolio, which culture and leisure, roughly 50% of our spend is from money that we generate as income. So, councils all around the country will do the same thing. So the fees and charges that we charge for on a whole range of things, from land hires to beach huts, that money goes back into the service in order to provide the service that we do provide as good as it is. So, should councils be income generators? Yes, but with proper guidelines around it. And unfortunately, what they've now done by shutting the stable door after the horse is bolted is meant that those people who did it in a fairly responsible way are also now being punished and made to dispose of those assets over time. So, the government initially said, "Oh, this is great. Councils are going out and investing and they're creating money, so we can keep cutting them, can't we?" Which is what happened. I think West Sussex was the key one, where they were trumpeting themselves as embracing austerity and doing everything the government wanted in the expectation that eventually the government would turn around and say, "You've done a cracking job, West Sussex. We're going to look after you." And when the government turned around and patted them on the back and said, "You've done a cracking job and now we're going to cut you even further," West Sussex was surprised. Oh, by the way, that was a Conservative-led authority. So, this is an absolute mess. And to hope that income generations is the main solution, it just isn't, I'm afraid. And there's no vehicle now to borrow the money to do it either.
So two departments, well, the only two departments that actually saw real terms increases in fundings in this statement were the NHS and education. Was that at least the right decision, or what would be better? If I can give that to Mark first.
Well, education, I'm very happy to talk about all day, being a teacher. And I've got some thoughts about this. The 3.3 million, I forget if it was Ian or Steve who touched on this already, but the shortfall in funding, given that all of the pay rises aren't going to be fully funded, allegedly, and that's what I'll be striking about. Not the fact it's just 5%, and that's way below the average, but the fact that they're not fully funded. And the increase in electric bills, I think we're talking about £230,000 deficit as a result of that in our school. And I think that mine's quite a small school. On average, I think it's over 350,000. I think all it's going to do is cover that. It doesn't help colleges. It doesn't help schools with special educational needs. In Hampshire, that will be a real worry because we have a lot of 11 to 16 secondary schools, and then everyone goes to college right the way across Hampshire, which is a great system. But the colleges are going to be struggling. Maybe they need to income generate as well. And all they're promising is to reach the 2010 levels of funding by 2025. So it's not enough. The way that they've siphoned some money off is a disgrace as well. I just want to talk for a second about the Oak Academy. They've given 43 million. I know it's not a huge sum, but it's a lot. It's enough to wind us all up. 43 million to the online Oak National Academy, which about a third of teachers say they've used at some point for cover lessons. The material on there is completely uninspiring. If the pandemic taught us anything about education, and lockdown, we're still in the pandemic, aren't we? But if lockdown taught us anything about education, it's that kids need a 3D immersive experience with teachers that know what they're doing, can personalize learning, which was Blair and Brown's mantra, can reach out to the kids, look at what they've done and work with them and keep personalizing that experience and inspire them and nurture them. And the gaps that are there now, behaviourally as well as academically, are because we switched to online. Now I know online's powerful; we can do more there. You wonder if that they think maybe they know something we don't. But for me, it's a tool that can enhance or back up learning a bit, which teachers are best placed to employ. The idea that you can create lots of generic material and then give that to everyone and they'll all learn the same thing and everyone will be brainy is just a fallacy. It's just pure nonsense. Funnily enough, Michael Gove, who just came up with some good policies as education secretary, but also just ripped it to pieces and was immoral in the way that he went about some changes. He's sitting on the Oak Academy now, along with some dragons from Dragon's Den, so I'm sure it'll be great. But that's proper wound me up. And as far as the NHS goes, that 14 billion that I said we could get from having a fair tax system, I'd like to see double the care there is for mental health. Just a quick, because I was thinking about it earlier, but I was enjoying listening to Steve too much. A quick one on the NHS and that funding. We spend about 14 billion at the moment on mental health, and it's about 11% of the NHS budget. Now, on the NHS, it was on an NHS website. That was the root of the address bar anyway. They said that there was there were 23% of patients at the moment, their disease, which is the word they used, was mental, and yet 11% is the amount we spend on that. And it seems very obvious to me we need to double the budget for mental health. And I know people who've had to deal with the crisis units, and they're doing their absolute best, those people, but they can't reach them in time. We're talking about people who've had to be on suicide watch from relatives while they wait the week required, not just talking about a 12-hour wait, but the week required to get the crisis team in. It's an absolute disgrace. It doesn't match up at all. We're way behind in terms of our funding there, and that's what I'd like to see most added to that 3.3 billion. There's another 14 billion to double that mental health capacity.
If I thank you, Mark, and if I can ask the same as Steve.
Yeah, I agree with what Mark wants to achieve. I think I've just got a slightly different view on where the funding needs to go, and that is that. And it's one of the things that when you asked me to come on here, it was a comment that I've made. And what I'm seeing day to day when I'm out and about around the city, the inevitability of reducing council funding, because that's what's happening, is that non-statutory services go. So the things that we're not legally obliged to deliver will cease to exist. So much of that is around early intervention, particularly in children's and adult social care, but also delivered through portfolios like mine, through culture, through events, well-being, community centres, places where people go to avoid that sense of isolation, to be able to be seen by somebody just working behind the desk in the community centre thinks, oh, we haven't seen Mr. So-and-so this week. I'll just give him a ring because he's one of our members and make sure he's okay. Those little things, those tiny little things, when you add up the millions of them that happen every day, what that's doing is that's stopping people from getting seriously ill and having poor mental health issues. It's also stopping a large amount of physical health issues from developing because it's making people go out and engage with their communities. People have been shut in for a long time. People are going to live less long because of COVID, because I've seen it in members of my own family. People have spent too much time indoors away from other people. They haven't been able to go out and do the things that they did before. It was lovely that the government said they could walk around their garden for an hour, but that's not what actually keeps people young and keeps them fit. Now, the impact of all of that post-pandemic in a funding environment where you're removing that ability of councils to deliver what they know best how to do, which is great early intervention work to support communities, create communities, build strength in communities. If that happens, then the time bomb in the NHS and in education is just going to tick even more loudly and even more quickly. Because in education alone, as Mark's just said, it's that immersive experience in education. It's also the summer reading challenge, the trips to the library, the school trips, which schools just don't do anymore because they just can't afford them. Taking kids to the theatre once a year, letting them see what life is like beyond their own very narrow community. I've got kids in Portsmouth, in Paulsgrove, who've never been to the sea. Now, it's insane, and we should be investing on that front end of all of this to keep people well physically, to keep them mentally fit so they don't suffer from poor mental health, and to invest in those kids so that they actually have a properly rounded education where every child in this country has an opportunity to engage regularly, and by that I mean multiple times per year at the very least, in a cultural activity that increases their self-confidence, develops their soft skills, and enables them to be better people. Exams on their own aren't anything. They're nothing. They're just pieces of paper. I go around and talk to employers. When we were doing the economy and skills strategy for the city, what did every major employer from BAE all the way through to the university tell me that they needed? They wanted students to come to them so that they had a greater ability to learn because their soft skills and their confidence were high. What did BAE tell me? They told me that they wanted people who weren't just academically good, but they had the ability to work in a team and had confidence. That's what we're not doing in this country. That's why we've got a deficit in economic growth. It's not that we're not innovative and we're not able to be creative, but we're not doing it in such a way that people feel confident enough to go out and do it. Instead of that, they're applying for a 15 quid an hour job to go and shelf stack in Tesco's because we put more value in that than we do in teaching and inspiring people. If you're going to close a library or you're going to delete events, people go, oh, that's a terrible thing, that's awful. But they should be screaming about it, because losing those things is losing the fabric of what makes this country successful and why it has such a huge amount of creative talent and such a wonderful cultural and heritage environment to live in, unfunded by government for so long. The Arts Council round that's just happened was a national embarrassment. And if we start to address those things, then we can build a UK that people feel proud of again. What we've got at the moment is something that's on life support and gets a dose of adrenaline every now and again just before a general election. Fed up with it.
Pretty forthright there, Steve, as we've come to expect. Again, if I can just turn the focus, just as we're closing in on the end of the show, looking at small business. Obviously, there was the freezing of the business rates, but and we've touched on the cost of power. And again, the double-edged sword, of course, will be the national living wage is going up by 9%. So that means for a lot of, particularly in retail and leisure and cafe and bars and everything else, that'll be a 10% jump in costs for the staff. I guess the question is there anything more that the government could have, should have done for local businesses, and did they miss a trick by not moving forward with an online sales tax, which seems to advantage the likes of Amazon, who are very skilled in the art of not paying their taxes? I'll throw that one to Mark first.
Yeah, I mentioned that one to you. I think they've managed to pay no tax at all this year. Amazon, they managed to offset, thanks to a Rishi loophole, £800,000 in tax last year, I think, against capital allowance. They're really good at that. And I can tell you that Jane, who runs Pebble Beach Cafe down the road, doesn't know how to get those loopholes. And I might shift this slightly, if you don't mind, and move it to, we've got online. There's a bit of an online versus retail tension here, and I'd just like to get underneath that a little bit, if that's allowed. I don't mean to avoid the question at all, but to answer it briefly, I think the freezing the business rates was the plea from business groups last week. Could they have done more? Yes, but it's difficult when you're bargaining for more for businesses. It's harder than when you're bargaining for education and for health. I think it's a tough gig, but we do need to protect them, and I think they could have dropped the business rates and funded it with an online tax. Now, in February, there was an online tax, sales tax consultation, and I never saw the outcome of that. I don't know if they've buried it. I don't know what it was, but they said they were going to get back to us in June, and I've not seen it publicised anywhere. I don't know if it's been published at all. But for me, it seems obvious there should be an online sales tax, and that should be used to bring down the business tax on high street commercial ventures. And I just wonder. It's another genuine question. I don't know if we should be fighting really hard to save shops, or we should be looking at where. Looking at the footfall fading away and looking at where that's going, and perhaps preparing to repurpose it all. And this is an area Steve will be an expert in leisure zones and new properties. And it's just admitting that they're on their way out and everyone's going to be online. I don't know which way to go. I don't know which way to go. But I personally find the high street a reassuring place to be. I like going to for coffee and then walking around malls. That seems more popular in other countries than it is here. We don't seem to invest in those. And I'm not sure what to do. Do we grasp the nettle and just say, look, it's the end of retail? Don't know.
So, Steve, you touched on it in one of your earlier answers about the concern for the death of high streets. I know that PCC has got some additional funding to try and look at regeneration. What are your thoughts?
I don't think high streets are dying. I think they're evolving. I always answer this question the same way because I genuinely believe it. I think what we need, though, is the opportunity for independence to grow. So earlier today, I was at the We Create market at the former Sainsbury's that the council bought a while back to the north of Commercial Road, where there was over 60 local traders, most of whom are makers. So they were selling things that they've actually made. Sorry, Portsmouth City Council, for those on the chat. So the items that they've made, they're creating in their bedrooms or their garages or their spare rooms, and they're taking them out and selling them. And they're building an audience and a market, and they're doing that partly online for awareness, but they also want to be able to sell physically, and their customers want to come and talk to them because they develop a relationship, and those relationships with shopkeepers and retailers are what we lost in this country. People joke about things like Are You Being Served? Quite rightly, great comedy series in my view. Floor walkers. Captain Peacock was a floor walker. The job of floor walkers was to go around the store and interact with regular customers and make them feel welcome. So they recognised Mrs. Smith and Mr. Jones as they came through the door, and that's why they came back. And they went to shop assistants at the counters in department stores who they recognised and they trusted to give them the right advice. So all of that went. All of the quality layers went, and you ended up with just basically lots of really simple shops identikit across the whole country doing exactly the same thing. Independents back in that environment again, doing what they do best, like my great-grandparents did with the shop they had in Edinburgh Road, where they lived upstairs. They spent their money in their friends' shops in the surrounding area. Their friends spent money in theirs. They had a regular clientele and a very loyal one. We need to go back to that. Not everybody wants to buy something on the internet. As a middle-aged bloke, buying clothes online is a flipping nightmare. Nobody's clothes sizes, and Simon's nodding, nobody's clothes sizes are the same. You buy a large in one place and it's an extra large from somewhere else. I bought a shirt the other week that I could put 2 poles in and sleep in for a week. So, those issues are not going to go away for a very long time, but the high street needs to be independent. It needs to be focused around quality and that personal connection. And then the bits of it that are no longer needed because there is spare capacity need to pivot over to cultural use, leisure uses, and a really good quality and independent hospitality sector, not endless chains where you can go to the same high street anywhere in the country and eat the same sandwich and drink the same drink. In the same way that retail chains have failed, that will eventually start to happen as well with some of the weaker hospitality brands. We're seeing a few of them going over the last couple of years. So I do think high street's got a future. To answer the question about what the government have done, I answered it earlier on. Actually, they could have cut that, because that's a direct impact that would have put money back in people's pockets and enabled them to have what little controllable spend they've actually got left in the middle of all this to spend a bit more money. That would have been really, really helpful. I don't think that the support for businesses will actually have done very much at all, because the costs of their overheads have gone up so much. I'm seeing the Wedgwood Rooms, Jeff Priestley was quoted in the paper saying his electricity bills tripled.
Yep.
Now, I'm telling you that the vast majority of hospitality outlets and entertainment venues will be running on roundabout maximum 10% net profit. So you've wiped out their profit just to turn on the lights every day. So, allowing them a bit of a business rates break, especially when a lot of the smaller businesses are already rates exempt, is not going to do very much at all. So I think small business should be absolutely screaming at the government right now to say, cut VAT. It's the only thing that's going to directly help us, because it enables us to, one, hold our prices, and that means potentially use that little bit of extra money that we've got coming in to cover our electricity bills. But it does mean we don't have to put prices up, which is only going to affect our business more seriously. But there's nobody who understands business in this government. We're talking about Kwasi Kwarteng earlier on. The guy had a degree in economic history, so he knows what went wrong, but he ain't got the faintest idea what to do in future to put it right. People like Grant Shapps. I mean, who are these people? This is a third-rate government populated with third-rate ministers. And to be frank, I don't see much better on the Labour benches either. We seem to be in the same position that America's in, where where's the talent? There's 60 million people in the country, and the best we can do is the 650 people currently sat in the House of Commons. It's a national embarrassment. I say that for some of my own lot as well. Where's the inspiration? Where's the forward thinking? There's no imagination left anymore. So this country's just decided to just have a slumber. It really frustrates me, because I'm so passionate about what this country could be and what it could achieve. But all the people here who could achieve it don't get help by their governments. And I just don't see it changing. Sorry.
Okay, that was definitely passionate and forthright as we're used to. Thank you, Steve. Was there anything quickly you wanted to add there, Mark, before I round up with a closing question? Quick.
Well, I mean, I managed to move us on to retail versus online, but the only other thing is to think about the how difficult it is to get cheap imports, and how expensive it is, and how much red tape there is now to export for businesses, and how they're having to move abroad. So I didn't want us to finish without mentioning the elephant in the room, and we need to rejoin the single market and the customs union.
Completely agree. I don't know if you saw it, Mark, but there was a thing that was doing the rounds on social media where Nigel Farage was quoted as trumpeting the Swiss model when he wanted to leave the EU. And now that there's a prospect that we might follow that model, according to multiple leaks from the government, the ERG are jumping up and down like lunatics as usual, and Farage is saying that it's a disgrace and the Conservative Party needs to be wiped out for suggesting
and
such
David
a thing.
Davis and Liam Fox and
yeah.
Daniel Hannan and Boris Johnson, and they all said the single market and the customs unions, we'd be mad to leave it, and then it evolved, and I think that that the harder Brexiteers, UKIP took control, didn't they?
Okay, I'll if I can now ask a closed question to you, I want an answer that's either better or worse. So, Steve, after the autumn statement, are we better or worse off?
I can't answer that. And I'm always on it. I can't answer it because at the moment, from a council perspective, I don't know yet, because we've got to do all the pluses and minuses and work out. I suspect we're worse off. If the question's about as a country and as people living in that country, we were worse off before it, and we're marginally less worse off than we were after Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss did their thing. But that's nothing to shout about.
That's not really a winning electoral slogan, is it? Less worse off than we were last week. Mark, worse or better off?
The only U-turn that I want the government to do, and they're so good at them, is to stop us just dipping and just the total ruination of Britain. And for me, this is we're still going the wrong direction, but it has slowed that down. It has slowed that awful descent down. It's a slower motion car crash than it was.
So thank you to both our guests for the positive and in beginning outlook. And I guess we expected we expected nothing less. But thank you. There was some great balance in there. You know, I don't think anybody expected a ringing endorsement of Mr. Hunt's work. So you've been listening to the Pompey Politics podcast. I've been Ian Tiny Morris.
And our guests have been...
You first, Steve.
Oh, sorry. That's my fault because I couldn't be introduced at the beginning. Councillor Steve Pitt from Portsmouth City Council.
And Mark Coates, trying to be a councillor over on Hayling.
Okay. And I've been Simon Sansbury. Thanks very much for listening and watching today's show. Join us next week, 6:27. Please don't forget to like, follow, subscribe on YouTube, on Facebook, and give us some reviews on wherever you listen to us as a podcast. Thank you very much.